I was over 50 years old before I had my first conversation with my mother about my dad. As a young boy, most of what I learned about my father was a result of eavesdropping. Stories were told about Dad being a pilot in the big war a few years earlier. When the adults would gather to chat in the living room, I would play inconspicuously on the floor in the next room, drinking in every word and trying to make whatever sense I could of their discussion. I heard horrible stories about a plane crash, POW camps, and starvation. I remember feeling an overwhelming sadness and shock when I realized it was my father they were talking about.
If you've been a regular viewer of this show, I think you'll agree with me that over the years we've had some pretty interesting interviews and panels, if you will. I mean, from talking about the Devil's Footprint on Town Hill to rum running in Ipswich, the Robinson Shipyard, the history of the immigration in this town and what they brought. But this one I think is going to be at the top of our list. We're about to introduce you to the author of a book called The Green Box. And rather than me blabbering on any further, I'm going to introduce you to the man behind it with the story. And it is a story, but it's all real. It's fascinating. Jim Kurtz, welcome to COA Today, Living Smart, Living Well.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
How did it start?
My dad died when I was 2 years old, so I never knew him. He was in World War II. He was a co-pilot over in Europe. He was shot down in 1944. Taken prisoner of war, and went through some pretty bad times and a really horrible march, but did make it back home in 45. And then in 1952, he had a fatal heart attack. He was 33. I was 2. My mother was 30 years old.
Oh, boy. Okay.
And I have 3 brothers. So it was 4 boys, ages 2 to 9. She suddenly became a single mom. And that started me wondering, you know, I wanted to know about my father. I needed to know something about my father. My 3 brothers had certain memories of them, even though they weren't very old. They had some kind of memories, and I didn't. And around our home, it was an unspoken rule that my brothers and I were not allowed up in the attic where the green box was. We weren't really told why. It was a hands-off kind of thing.
Yeah.
So my 3 brothers who listened well didn't go up there, that I know of anyway. I, who did not listen so well, at 8 years old, I couldn't take it anymore, went up there. I'll never forget, it was a really hot day, and my 3 brothers were out, so they couldn't get me in trouble. My mom, I think, was vacuuming, and I got up there and opened up this is the green box.
This is the box.
Opened up the green box for the first time and looked at everything in total awe, had no idea what any of it meant. And the worst part of it, even it hit me as an 8-year-old, was that I wasn't going to find out because my mother had said we're not allowed in the box. So I couldn't bring something down and say, hey, Mom,
what's this?
What's this? And therefore, I closed it back up after about a minute or 2 with my heart beating wildly, and then was up there probably another 10 or 20 times before I went off to college. But each time, just couldn't get up the nerve to ask my mom. She grieved pretty deeply about my dad, actually all her life.
Yeah.
In 2001, I received an email from a fellow named Gerd Leitner. He was an Austrian, and he invited members of both the American and German fighter squadron and bomber squadron that had an air battle over his town. He was 8 years old at the time, and in 30 seconds, 8 bombers and 5 fighters were shot out of the sky. And he witnessed the entire thing as an 8-year-old. And his life went on for 50 years also. And then he decided to have a commemoration, invited, if there were people still alive that were in that particular battle, they came, otherwise next of kin. And I readily accepted. Took my older son, Mike, who was at that time a junior in Boston College, and off we went to Airwald. And at that point in time, a series of events started to happen that were so surreal that I still, when I talk about them, I can't believe them. 2 German fighter pilots were there. They'd have invited. A fellow came over to me and looked at my name tag, and he said, "Oh, I recognize your name. I'm the German fighter pilot that shot your father down."
Holy smokes.
Well, you can imagine, I just looked at him and I said, well, how would you know that? And he said, every B-24 Liberator has a designation of a color and a letter on the tail, and I saw your dad's red H right in the sights.
Holy smokes.
And then he began to tell me the story of what a great day it was and how beautiful it was. And, my son is sitting there pulling me back, and I'm listening to him. And then he actually had the nerve at the end to say, Mr. Kurtz, it was like shooting ducks in a pond. And that's what he said to me. So the next day, Garrett Leitner, who was that child that saw everything happen, is a huge hiker. He owns a sports store in the middle of town. Arranged a hike for anyone else that wanted to try to get up 6,400 feet up into the Alps. It's really surreal. You're just climbing, and all of a sudden you come over the top of a bluff, and there's cows and sheep with bells on, and then there's this big plane wreckage, like sitting right in the middle of the...
60 years later.
Yes, because basically the other 7 bombers that were shot down all crashed at the bottom of the Alps, and the Germans took that for scrap metal in a matter of days.
Sure.
But who's going to haul stuff down 6,400 feet from the Alps? This is actually a piece of his co-pilot seat. Garrett Leitner had done so much research getting all these names, but he also pulled another one out of the hat and pulled this sketch of a difference between a co-pilot seat and a pilot seat in a B-24 bomber.
How the devil did he ever find that?
I have no idea. But he also had been up to that crash site so many times that he knew where the nose went down. He went over there. We dug around for a little bit, and we extracted this out. This is part of my father's co-pilot seat from the crash site. The last thing that happened was I met a woman on the way back down. Her name was Debbie Beeson. Her father had been a substitute gunner that day on my dad's plane.
Well, that's right. In the book, there were a few guys that had
Three of them. And 2 of them died that day. The only 2 KIAs on that plane were 2 people that had volunteered. The tail gunner, a guy named Charlie Sellers, was on his 33rd mission. If you volunteer, you get credit for 2 missions, which would made it 35, and he would have come home. They went over there, they bombed, they came back, and unfortunately, the pilot of my dad's plane made a really horrible decision and separated his group from the rest. It's a sad story. He did not make it, but this other fellow did, and told his daughter that if I decided to make the trip, to tell me the story. And basically she said in about a half minute, I would not be talking to you if it wasn't for your dad. And she told me that my dad was the last one out of the plane, except for her father, who it turns out got wrapped up in his parachute cords in the wreckage. The plane was going down, it was on fire. My dad was injured, and he yelled for my dad. My dad turned around, got up, and freed him from his cords.
In a burning plane.
They jumped
going down.
Jumped out simultaneously, and 5 seconds later, the plane blew up midair.
9 out of the 10 survived the bombing. Right?
8 out of 10.
8 out of 10.
The tail gunner was killed in the action.
Yeah.
The other one that had actually substituted just made a bad decision. Yeah. Also, I guess he didn't like heights, even though he was in a bomber. So he didn't want to jump out of the plane. These guys had no training for parachute training at all, nothing. Their whole training was jumping out of a 20-foot tower in a gymnasium.
That was your father's first jump, right?
Everybody's first jump.
Everybody's first jump. Good God.
It's called the Caterpillars Club. You get a card if you make it through.
Wow.
Because that's the first jump that's the only jump that saved your life. And he jumped without a parachute. He waited till the plane got close to what he thought was deep snow, and he just went at the side of the mountain. Wasn't found until 1946. I had met Tim Russert, who was a commentator on NBC, Meet the Press. He knew about my book. He took me into another room and he said, Jim, if you don't write a book on what's happened to you over in Austria, and then since that time, then shame on you. So that's kind of, to answer in a long way, that's how it started.
The book is fascinating, and I will tell you, it brought me to emotional states. There's a couple of passages in here that you have a wonderful way of relating.
As it did me. Okay. There were many times when I really had to stop and kind of gather myself together, realizing what my father had gone through. It really was 50 years before I even asked my mother one question about my father, which is people find amazing. When it wasn't out there she just didn't want to talk about it.
Was she mad at you that you went into the box?
No, eventually no, not at all. Okay. Not at all. And I don't know, she probably wouldn't have been mad at me the first time, but we didn't want to cross that barrier.
Tell us about some of these things that are in the box, because obviously there's one right here.
Well, yeah, there's, this is his Purple Heart.
Wow.
He was injured that day in that battle. He got a piece of shrapnel that went through his leg. This is an air medal. You get an air medal for being in 20 combat missions. So he received that. He was actually shot down on his 20th. This is a prisoner of war medal, which was not in the green box. In 2012, I heard from his bombardier, who I thought had passed away. He lived in Florida. I found out about it, and I asked him when I could come see him. And he said, well, when would you like? And I said, how about tomorrow morning? And I hopped a flight the next day, went down there, because I knew he was ill. He had been ill. And we swapped stories. He told me a few things that I did not know about my dad. And then I asked him if he had ever gotten his Purple Heart, because I knew that everybody on that flight had gotten injured. And he said, no, there was a big fire in St. Louis, and a lot of the records were lost, and he just never really pursued it.
Wow.
Life went on. So I said to him, would you like to have a Purple Heart? And he said, sure, but I'm not, at 87 years old, I'm not going after it. And from that day on, when I left him, without him knowing in the beginning anyway, I got a hold of his congressman down there and drove the man crazy for about 2 to 3 weeks until, even without the information, he was able to award him the Purple Heart.
Beautiful.
And at that time, George said, well, you know what, I've got 2 prisoner of war medals, and I don't know why. So he was kind enough to give me the second one. One other interesting thing in the box was this set of dog tags. There are 3 sets. One was when he was flying in states, because you could put down your next of kin and their address. Then when you flew your bombing missions, all it was your name, rank, and serial number. Finally, this is actually what they call a Kriegi dog tag. That was his dog tag when he was in Stalag 3. So it's printed in German, and he was prisoner number 7241.
Wow.
2 years ago, I'm in New Orleans for a reunion of Stalag 3, whoever's still physically alive. And there were 6 guys that were there. Nice talking to them, learn a little about it, but, you know, I knew kind of most everything about it. I'd done so much research. Go back, my wife and I go to the airport. We're sitting in the airport, and I look over, and there's this old Afro-American sitting in a wheelchair with a Tuskegee Airman hat on, right? So I go up, as I do with every vet, went up and thanked him for his service, and went back and sat with my wife. And then I said, you know what, Julie? I said, I got to go back one more time. After all that stuff that's happened here, I just got to go back. And I went back and I said, you know, do you mind me asking a couple questions? She says, no. I said, you know, I know you were in the European Theater of Operations. I know you were based in Italy. I said, so was my dad. I said, when? And he said, from January to October of 44. And I'm going, click. I said, really? I said, do you know that, you know, would you know if you had flown on August 3rd to a place called Friedrichshafen in Germany? He said, I can't really remember. He's flown 409 combat missions, by the way, through 3 wars. Jesus. But he kept all his flight logs. So I signed him a book immediately, gave him a book, and I said, you know, do me a favor, go home, check your logs, and just, you know, just check it for the heck of it.
Yeah.
He calls me up the next morning, and he flew fighter support for my dad. He was on my dad's wing that day.
Wow.
When my dad shipped overseas, my oldest brother, Bob, who lives right here in Ipswich, was a 1-year-old child, and they were out in Casper, Wyoming. He was doing heavy bomber training, and bought a pair of baby slippers, originally probably to keep his feet warm, and eventually he shipped overseas. So she kept one. That would be this one, which is, you know, it's 70-something years, so it's in much better shape. This one my dad took. So it was 2 things. It was one for good luck, but more so it was the fact that my mom would keep hers, my dad would take his, and hopefully he would be able to come back and return it to her. So the day he was shot down, when I have to regress a little bit, when I was in Airwald for this commemoration, I met a woman who actually saw my father get shot down and captured by the Germans, and she could prove it. She saw an airman coming over top of the hill. He was bleeding. He was being chased by 3 German soldiers. They knocked him to the ground. They aimed their guns at him. They were going to shoot him. He didn't know any German, so he pulled this baby slipper out of his jacket, hoping that one of these German guards or soldiers would be a family man, and it must have worked. One of them must have been, because they put their guns down and took him prisoner. So he kept this through interrogation, solitary confinement, 3 prisoner of war camps, and a horrible march called the Death March. They had to march through horrible conditions. They were all sick, and somehow most of them made it. And when he finally got liberated by George Patton, April 29th, 1945, in a camp in Moosburg, Germany, that was built for 20,000 prisoners of war. When Patton arrived, there were 130,000 POWs in that camp, my dad being one. And they made the trip home, and he came in his victory ship, sailed past the Statue of Liberty, got off his ship, and handed this back to my mom.
Wow.
So this book is a love story almost more than anything else. It's a memoir and it's a biography, but it's truly a love story.
So you went through all this, you have contact with Tim Russert, and you decided you'd write the book.
I did.
Wow.
And I got to know my father. I would say
Wonderful.
at this point in time, I probably know my father better than anyone, obviously, except for my mother, only because I now have basically been able to follow his footsteps in every single thing he did. I tried to emulate everything he did. I actually, when I turned 16, I went out to Arizona and realized the only thing I had not done, because I had flown on the B-24 that comes into town at Beverly Airport, Collins Foundation, and I had been to where he crashed, and I'd been down where he was captured. And then I realized I had never jumped out of a plane. So
Oh boy.
I decided to go skydiving. It's my 60th birthday.
No kidding.
And although, that was exciting for me, but all I could think about what he was thinking
In those conditions,
as
too.
he was going down with all the Germans down there, all just waiting for him.
Have you had any speaking opportunities, Jim?
Actually, I have. I've spoken at the AMVETS. I've been in Salem State, a lot of assisted living places, Brooksby Village, where my mom was, where she lived. But the most inspiring and the most meaningful one to me was at Ipswich High School. Molly Smith, the head of the history department, contacted me and ordered some books, and she put it into the curriculum for Ipswich High School.
Oh, cool.
And they didn't have to read the whole book. There was just sections of it, but it was obvious that they had, because I was invited up to do a power presentation, went up there, and their eyes were glued at what I was saying. They weren't shooting things at me and throwing paper and falling asleep.
Checking their phones.
Yeah, they were really, really into it. And then afterwards, when I was done, asked some incredibly insightful questions. And to me, the kids these days just don't know anything about World War II. It's not really their fault. It's just not, taught much. I was so happy to hear that Molly, taught it in her class. And these kids really, really received it well.
Where do you get the book?
Well, there's different places. It's on Amazon.
Okay.
It's also in iBooks. It is on Kindle.
Read it. It'll bring you smiles. It'll make you choke up. And I think it'll make you applaud the effort.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.